Someone like to give apologies if they've received them from Councillor Hollis? Oh, thank you. Okay, well, someone move apologies for lateness. Moved by Councillor Robson, seconded by Councillor Arbery. Put that, all those in favour, please say aye. Against and carried. There's no public forum today. No late items, no confidential business to be transferred into the open. There is no change to the order of business. If we can turn to 6.1, the minutes. Are there any corrections required to the minutes as displayed in your agenda? Cracking set of minutes, Raj. You can just say that. No, can somebody prepared to move those minutes? Moved by Councillor Arbery, seconded by Councillor Salisbury. I'll put that, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, and that is carried. Any matters arising from the minutes? Nope. Okay, fantastic. And we moved all three sets of minutes together. Thank you. Any declarations of conflict of interest?
Yes, Mr.
Councillor
Chairman.
Baldock.
Just in regard to the item of the adoption of the use of council land policy review, it is on the members' register that I lease a piece of a stormwater reserve. I'm simply declaring it. It's already publicly known. I'm not withdrawing from that item because it is only about starting a process of consultation and so on, but just to be clear, I would mention it this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baldock. Councillor Arbery.
Yeah, I'm a trustee with Takitimu House who has a peppercorn lease with the council.
Thank you for that declaration. Any further declarations? No. Okay, let's move on to the first order of business, colleagues. 8.1, the adoption of the Library Archives Policy. And Emma Joyce, our policy analyst, will be presenting this paper to us. Over to you, Emma.
Kia ora, good morning. I also have Abby from the libraries here as well, if there's any technical questions that Abby's best to answer. So just this report is to adopt a policy so that we have best practice management of our archive collection housed downstairs in the library. So I'm happy to take the report as read and just answer any questions.
Any questions, colleagues, on the paper? No colleagues got a look left, both left and right this morning. No questions. Is somebody prepared to move the recommendations as written on page 53 of our agenda? Councillor Hughes, you prepared to move. Is someone prepared to second that? Councillor Salisbury. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Hughes?
Of our material in our collection, and it looks like great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Salisbury. Any further speakers to the resolution on the table? I'll just say in short, it's a good policy, and it's right that we adopt it today rather than go through a consultative procedure. I'd also say that this allows our library staff to say no from time to time to certain items should members of the public wish to contribute them and they not be of suitable, what's the word I'm looking for? Can someone help me? Suitable? Yeah, provenance. Thank you, Councillor Robson. So that's that. Mover, do you wish to exercise the right to reply? No. Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? No abstentions. That is carried unanimously. If we can turn now to page 47 of our agenda, colleagues. This is the use of council land policy review. Quite a reasonable sized piece of work here. Melanie Atkins, Senior Policy Analyst, will be presenting this paper to us. Over to you, Melanie.
Good morning. Actually, I'll just move and pop. Say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm not sure if you can see the detail of that from there, but while you'll see from this report that it's largely procedural and that we're asking your agreement to the next steps in the process, it covers quite a diverse array of policy issues across the different types of council land. So this came from the policy prioritisation last year and is progressing with a team from across council. I'm sure you'll appreciate that when we talk about public use of council land, that touches almost every activity area of council, and in essence that's largely what that land is there for. But obviously as the population is growing, private land areas have gotten smaller, you've got more and more demand for uses of that public land and quite a diverse array of things that people would like to do there. So over the years, we've added policies on top of policies as specific issues have arisen and have required addressing by successive councils. So today we've got 19 different policies on the use of council land, as well as documents like the Reserve Management Plan, the City Plan, the Infrastructure Development Code and 14 bylaws. So depending what some member of the public wants to do on council land, they have to navigate any number of those documents. So it's pretty unwieldy, and really the purpose of this review is how do we make that easier? How do we simplify that process? How do we make it more consistent across members of the public and different pieces of land? The intent of this review is to provide a policy framework for future use and management of council land that's fair and consistent, and obviously a whole lot easier to navigate if somebody wants to do an activity. After working through the investigative phase with the team, we've looked at the current issues and we've developed a 4-part structure to essentially break this piece of work into manageable bites, and particularly for that engagement with the community. Engagement here will be really important because for lots of these questions, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's about deciding how do we best meet the needs of the Tauranga communities and how do we apply that in a fair way across these different pieces of land and different uses. So part 1 looks at the community, private and commercial use of council land policy, and primarily issues around use of reserves under the Reserves Act, stormwater reserves and commercial activities, so things like leases and licences to occupy. And that's the piece we're looking for your agreement today to proceed with. Part 2 will look at road reserves as a separate policy and what activities members of the public can take on road reserves. Parts 3 and 4, have identified a small number of policies that need to be reviewed independently from this larger piece of work, and some of those will remain as standalone policies or be deleted. And what we're seeking today is your agreement to continue the review process to the proposed structure, the way we're looking to undertake that work, and of course to engage on part 1. You'll then be presented with the results, probably through a series of issues and options paper. I think because of the diversity and the number of issues, that might not all fit in one paper. We might do that in a few different pieces. And a draft policy, once that's developed, we'll go back out and consult with the public again on what the wording of that is and what the proposed rules will be.
I've got a question from Councillor Robson.
Sorry, Chair, just signalling happy to move.
Are there any questions from colleagues? Councillor Baldock, then Salisbury.
Thanks, Melanie. Just in regard to that road reserve policy, I note you mentioned the government accessible streets package, but the national policy statement, the government policy statement, national policy statement of urban development removing parking requirements may well have an impact on how people wish to make use of some rather wide berms and stuff. Will you be looking into that as you go through it?
Absolutely, and certainly as any announcements are made, that may speed up or slow down the start of that work.
Councillor Salisbury.
Thank you. I think this is a really important piece of work. The question I have is, it mentions privately leased public road berms in other cities. Do we have anything like that here?
Not that I'm aware of. Mostly we have LTOs on the road berms. There are some areas of road where there's proposed to be road stopping, things like that, but generally they're licences to occupy rather than lease on road berms, but it's not certainly out of the question.
Yes, supplementary.
Thank you. On paragraph 26, there's the 4A to D there. I just wonder, D, does that include the marine precinct? When it talks about the Tauranga Marina, is it like the city wharfs and the marine precinct, or is it just the marina?
That's just the marina, so that's quite an old policy and it does expire next year. So it's largely contractual what's in there. So no, it doesn't cover the marine precinct.
Mayor Powell.
I may have missed it, but you know, we are, as we know, a fast-growing city, arguably one of the fastest in the country. I just don't see a dedicated commitment to the retention of green space as the city grows. And I'm just wondering if that isn't an omission, or if it's just something that we believe will be catered to. And I wonder if I have missed it, or if it is going to be in there. And I ask this question because having seen, well, as we grow, the retention of, you know, dedicated green spaces, open fields, places to use as public amenities is going to become increasingly important. And I'm just not seeing that in there. Have I missed it, or is it in there in some other form?
I believe that's largely covered by the Reserve Management Plan. So the Reserves Act sets out a lot of the, I guess, the higher level rules and regulations for our green spaces. So most of those green spaces are held under the Reserves Act, and that prohibits a lot of things happening. This specific piece of work sits under the Reserve Management Plan and deals with, I guess, a lot of the more subjective issues of commercial licences, of recreation activities, the different things that can or can't happen that the Reserves Act enables, and that you can choose whether that happens here or not. So the green spaces themselves should be preserved under that Reserve Management Plan. This won't take away any of those green spaces, but it does ask those questions around, are you going to provide leases in those spaces? Is that a yes? Is that a no? There are lots of existing ones. A lot of those are coming up for renewal after, 10, 30 years, some of them. And so this is asking that question in advance. Will we continue to do those types of things?
The Chair, also the Council does have a level of service policy on both active reserves, which is all your active sports field, and passive reserves, which is your neighbourhood areas. The active reserve looks at space per 1,000 population for different types of activities, and the passive looks at quantum and quality of space within a 400 metre walking distance from residential homes. So that's all taken into account on the urban planning side. This piece of work is saying, once we have land that is council owned for whatever reason, how do we utilise that, and how will we provide permanent rights, temporary rights, etc. to that land? It's not around what land do we need where. That's dealt with through the other level of service statements that we have.
Okay, Christine, that's really helpful. Thank you, Chair. Just a supplementary on that then. I'm thinking not so much about, I'm just going to use two examples, as we go out thinking about Tatuma. I'm not so much thinking about that, because one would imagine in time with a population forecast of 25,000, that would be, there would be fields, sports fields, whatever. I'm more thinking about Te Papa. As we go up across time, the dedication of green space, just thinking off the top of my head, there are some, of course, there's some in Greaton and Maryvale, there's the Memorial Park, there's of course the racecourse and down that area, and of course there's the domain at this end. But I worry that as we go up, and I'm just wondering if the policy caters for it in the way that is, going to future-proof it, so that land isn't cribbed for development that would otherwise be dedicated to public amenity and green space. As we go up, this per 1,000, this ratio of X amount of green space per 1,000 residents, I just wonder if we've considered it strategically for the future of the city.
There has been some work done on that, and I'll check. So that's coming to you, I think, in October in the Urban Form and Transport Development Committee, where you'll get the Te Papa Spatial Plan for consideration, and that does look at the green spaces, and it looks about, there are principles about a green corridor running through the area, but I'll check the specific question, but that will come back to you next month for you to raise that point if you wish.
Councillor Hughes.
I'm just wondering about the definition, the two definitions between our recreation parks and our community parks. And I noticed that I was involved with the Arataki Park, and there were certain things that some of the community would like to have done around the edges, but couldn't because it's designated a sports park. So therefore, under this rule framework, it doesn't have the opportunity to have some flexibility in there. And I'm just, what is the opportunity within this? Does this piece of work then look at that and think, well, maybe there's an opportunity for cross-definition, or are we kind of still going to separate those parks out so that they are very clearly defined?
Unfortunately, most of that is done under the Reserves Act, which was written in 1974, and of all the legislation I'd love to see reviewed, that's probably quite high on the list. It is very restrictive, particularly in terms of those definitions, so the policy can't change those definitions under the Act. There are processes where you can change how we've classified it under the Reserves Act, but if it is a sports field, and it's still going to be used for sports fields, we probably wouldn't change it then to a recreation reserve. I can look into that further if you'd like, but it probably doesn't change it under the Act. This piece of work won't.
Right, so that's a government act that defines that rather than, yeah, okay, thank you. I don't expect you to do more work on that, thank you.
I'm minded of a quote from Bill Murray, don't ever cross the streams. But when we're talking about reviewing community events, market stalls policy, is there the opportunity through that to address the user fees and charges element at the same time? Because it would kind of make a little bit of sense to have guidance around the quantum of the figures being charged when we're looking at the policy.
That's expected to come at the end of this process. So certainly, if we change the policy, we will likely need to change some of those user fees and charges, depending what decisions you make. But certainly that will be assessed as part of the project. Probably once we've decided what that policy looks like, what are the user fees and charges that need to come out. So one of the key questions here is actually what should we be charging for? What activities, whether that's markets or stalls, commercial activities, community activities, and there's probably likely to be some significant changes to those user fees and charges.
Thank you. Any further questions, colleagues? No. Councillor Robson, you've indicated you wish to move the recommendations on page 47. Seconded by Mayor Powell. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Robson?
Yeah, I think when people were looking at this agenda, they may not have identified this as a topic which would raise so many questions. But it sort of reflects, if you like, the complexity of local government and the challenges we face. And as has been made clear, central government passes legislation, so they legislate. Our job is to then try and make that work at a community level. And there are competing interests, and quite often when central government legislate, it is somewhat blunt, nuanced, and we have to work our way through those legislative requirements to try and find the best optimised mix of regulations and rules and policies that relate to land, and the things that we do interact with other pieces of legislation. So what we do under the Reserves Act will interact with other pieces of legislation, such as the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. It's a complex business, this, and I suppose I'm pleased that we're addressing it in this way. I believe that what will come from this process is the flushing out of a number of issues, and I think that people have already given some indication of they're aware of what's coming down the line. I think the critical path in this process will be the level of community engagement, to make sure that our community understands the framework that we work within, that we're not able to change, because we will need to justify the conclusions of this work to our community. We need to maximise the number of people who understand, are comfortable with it. This is a very large piece of work that intersects with a number of other areas. I just make that point because one of the comments I frequently hear from people is, what do all those people do at council? Well, this is one of those very important things, and trust me, when you're getting a phone call from a community organisation at 10 o'clock at night, unhappy with a policy, you understand the importance of getting it right. I think this is a good document, this is a good process, and I commend it to my colleagues.
Thank you. Seconder, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with Councillor Robson entirely, and it is that interface between central and local government, and Councillor Baldock, I think, highlighted really well one of the challenges, having dwellings developed without dedicated car parks, which is going to be an interesting change. While it happens overseas, we see it in cities like New York, of course. This is not New York, so we're used to having a car park. And it's going to be interesting to see how, to Councillor Robson's comment, that is nuanced in terms of the detail on how we communicate that to the community. So I agree with him entirely. My issue, which I mentioned, really is making sure that the policies are well considered for the strategy, the future of the city, and that the green spaces that we have currently remain adequate. And some would argue that there's enough, and some would argue there's not enough. But I can say that when I look and reflect on what BVL is today, the amenities that we had in the 1960s, many of which still are here today in terms of the community halls bill, which is a bit of a worry, I think were greater than they are today. And yet the population was, considerably smaller. And while there has been some inroads, I think there's an opportunity with this policy to look at amenity, green space, and to Councillor Robson's point of view, nuancing government policy so it's in a more detailed and practical way for the city going forward. So I think it's a good policy, and also I commend it to everyone. Thank you, Chair.
Any additional speakers? No. In that case, is there a right of reply from Councillor Robson? No. In that case, I shall put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against?
Abstention.
An abstention from Councillor Arbery. Sorry, a little slip of the tongue there. Councillor Arbery. Moving now to page 53 of our agenda, 8.3, the community outcomes consultation results. And Fiona Norder, our strategic advisor, will present this paper to us.
Good morning. This is a fairly straightforward paper. It follows on from our earlier meeting this year when we presented the draft community outcomes and draft principles to you. I'll move through it quite quickly, but happy to stop for questions. So we took these out for consultation for a 3-week period in July, and had approximately 550 responses. Not all of those responses answered all questions. The very first question we asked is, are these the right outcomes for council to be working towards? A total of 535 people answered this, and 436 of them, or 81%, agreed that these are the right outcomes for our council. Of those who disagreed, the main reason, 41% disagreed because they thought the focus was wrong. It was quite hard to break that down further as people had a really wide range of views. Other reasons for disagreeing with the outcomes were that they felt we should be focusing on sort of basics and that the outcomes were maybe not worded right or too complex. But overall, there was a very high level of support. We also asked people to prioritise outcomes, ranking them from 1 to 5. There was a really clear trend here. The outcome focused on the environment was by far and away people's most important outcome, with 58% of respondents ranking this as either their first or second most important outcome. There are two main reasons for this. People view the environment as integral to their own health and well-being, or our own health and well-being as a community, and they also see it as Tauranga's most important asset and why many of us choose to live here. The second most important outcomes for council to be working towards were seen as the city planning and transport outcomes. However, having said that, many people commented that the outcomes are interlinked, that they were all important, and that delivering on one outcome would deliver better results for all outcomes. So they weren't seen by most people as standalone. The other set of statements we took out to the community were principles. So these are value-based statements about how we do our business as a council. Overall, there was support for these, but what became really clear is that a group of the community didn't feel that we were delivering on those. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to be clearer about how these principles are integrated into our processes and projects. And that's something that we'll be looking at as we move forward with the LTP. Any questions?
Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, they make perfect sense. The outcomes do. It's just the challenging part is to, and I think that it was put somewhere in the report, how does these outcomes, our city vision work and our sustainability framework, how do we not duplicate, and how do we make sure that we're just not doing a whole bunch of different reports, and what does that look like for actual on the ground practical, how do people see themselves in this, and how does it work? That's the challenge, I guess.
So these we need to have community outcomes for every LTP. So we saw an opportunity to refresh the outcomes that we had for this LTP, but these outcomes may change as the City Vision project progresses. So the City Vision project is going to have a far greater level of community engagement than we did for these outcomes, and really that's part of the reason why we had a shorter consultation period for this. In terms of the sustainability aspect, Jeremy's going to be presenting a paper next that's going to talk more about that and how that fits in with the City Vision process. But we are looking at how we can align the different pieces of work and coordinate them. Thank you.
Councillor Kitty.
Is 552 people a true representation of our entire community? Given that it was, I think it was 3.5 months, and was it 16,500? Is that a true representation?
Look, it's not a bad turnout for this type of survey, but we consciously didn't go forward with the full in-depth community engagement exercise. And you may remember we spoke about this when we first brought these draft community outcomes with you, because we do want to do that via the City Vision project, and we thought it would be quite confusing if we did a very in-depth, full-on community engagement exercise at this point and then came back to our community in 6 months' time essentially doing the same thing. So we decided that at this particular point in time we would go out and have a lighter touch with our community, refresh what we already had. These outcomes, don't forget that these draft outcomes were also refreshed based on our previous outcomes and took into account a number of pieces of consultation and engagement that we've taken over the past couple of years. So they weren't based, this particular piece of community feedback isn't the only input into these outcomes. They are based on past consultation and engagement. The other reason why we did a shorter community engagement piece for this was time pressures as well for the LTP, that we are moving quickly to catch up and regain time that we lost earlier this year, and a long drawn out piece of engagement on this wouldn't have allowed us to keep moving on other pieces of work such as activity management plans that need some clarity around outcomes.
Councillor Salisbury, then Baldock.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm really happy with the report. I think it's a great report. I just have it's a process question, I guess. The engagement that we did get, 535, do we capture what percentage of those come from the different media? Like I saw there's a really great range of ways that we reached out to people. Do we know what comes back to us and what percentage?
We have some information on that, and I haven't captured this in the report, but I can dig a little bit further on that and come back to you.
Thank you. That'd be helpful. It'd just be good to know what are our most effective ways of engaging, but also where we can potentially boost some of the areas that we don't get so much.
one of the biggest areas where we got people is straight from the annual plan. So people who had submitted on the annual plan were invited to submit on this. And, yeah.
Councillor Baldock.
Thank you. Happy to move when we finish questions, Mr. Chair, if you like. Fiona, in paragraph 11, when you talk about that 13%, 12 people who want council to focus on the basics, core infrastructure and services, is there any data previously or any other surveys that we can compare that with? Because it's the old 3 R's, the roads, rates and rubbish, which changed dramatically in 2002, but it seems to hang over local government as being what we're meant to be doing, but actually, our purpose has changed enormously. Can we compare that with anything to see if that's a dwindling number of sort of people that feel that way about our role?
Not that I'm aware of, but one thing I will add to that is a lot of those comments that were about basics were really also had a theme about keeping rates low, and they viewed focusing on basics as an opportunity to keep rates low.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Hughes.
I'm just following on from the engagement analysis. Do we do an analysis on what demographics contribute every time we do these kind of, so that we can start over time to get a picture and to see where we might be lacking in the kind of people that we're engaging, so we can reach a little bit better every time? How is that feeding into the...
We didn't ask those questions for this particular survey. We wanted to keep it short and quite simple for people. We have done that for previous surveys, most notably the Vital Update, where a lot of effort was made to match demographics against our community and see that.
Councillor Hughes, if I could just add to that, that is the role of the engagement team at the moment, to determine those stakeholder groups and the most effective breadth of feedback. So they are tracking that. Yep.
Thank you.
So if I could just add to that, so we don't always just use each project in its own in the consultation for that project. We look at all the other information that we've received to date that is relevant. So things like vital signs are really relevant and draw into this, and we've got lots of data in there around the different demographics in different parts of the city, etc. We did quite a significant process as part of the old TTP, talking to people about transport and quite a lot of data. So all of those pieces of information are utilised, as long as it's reasonably current, as we go through the next piece of work. So we don't, we add to it, but we draw from much of that again, pull those key threads out, because people talk about a range of things and we engage with them. Sometimes it's directly relevant to the topic and sometimes it's related to other things, and we need to make sure that when we pick up those other projects we draw back through the feedback that we've received from them, so we don't work in isolation in one bubble of a project.
Nice, thank you.
Okay, if there's no further questions, Councillor Baldock has indicated he wishes to move the recommendations and Councillor Clout's prepared to second them. Do you wish to speak to them, Councillor Baldock?
Yes, thank you. Just on one point, on paragraph 17, the principles, I took real heart from that. I mean, I think the survey was a good response at 535, and we only had a 3-week period. I remember when we debated whether we would actually consult on this, and we kind of wondered, would we or wouldn't we, and was there enough time and all the rest of it. But that's not a bad response. But here on the principles, the highest response for a yes, have we got our principles right? Yes, 76% said we work in partnership with tangata whenua, our communities, sub-regional stakeholders and central government. And I think that's worthy of a comment, that perhaps our community's view of how we work and operate is changing in light of the decision to have Maori wards and work more on involving tangata whenua, mana whenua in our decision making. I think that perhaps bodes well. We can't read too much into a 535 person response, but it is at the top of the list. People see that we need to work with our sub-regional stakeholders and with central government, and I think that's something that our Mayor at the moment has been working very hard on during this term, and we're seeing good results from that.
Seconder, do you wish to speak? If you can get the technology to endorse you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bordock. Look, I think it's no coincidence that these community outcomes align very closely with the 4 well-beings, which of course is what, as a council, we are supposed to be addressing in a positive way through the work that we do. So we're talking about the environment, the economy, social and cultural, and so each of those 4 well-beings is addressed here. I appreciate the staff did not go to the full extent in terms of consultation, because that runs into consultation fatigue, and something that we have to be very considerate of as a council. And just finally, all of these community outcomes will feed into the next paper, which we'll be talking about in terms of sustainability and also our city vision. So I commend this to our colleagues.
Any further speakers? Councillor Robson.
Yeah, it's interesting the mover remarked on the debate about whether to go and consult with the community. There was some discussion. I was in favour of going to the community, and I'm pleased we did. I'm not surprised at what the community came back with. This is a small piece of research, and I think we need to take on board the words of Christine Jones when she points out that this is not the only basis for the way we move. This is in fact in one part addressing a legislative requirement. We have to have outcomes. I think we need to, when we go through this, be calm and considered, and we mustn't look, in the immortal words, to use research in the same way that a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. I noticed the mover's reference to the 76% and his comments associated with that number. I noticed he didn't pick up the prioritisation of the 4 well-beings in the chart earlier on in the report, which indicated that the top priority is environment, followed by social, followed by economic, and at the bottom of those 4 priorities is cultural. We don't want to get into a situation where people use an attempt to engage with our community and understand them as a chance to litigate their own personal political bases, perspectives. It's really important that this is owned by all our communities. I applaud the use of consistent language and the acknowledgement that we needed to use the word communities all the way through, because that acknowledges, in a way, the diversity of the communities that we have in this city. And I think it's really important also the observation, I think it's in para 35, I haven't got it in front of me, around the fact that on the Vision project there will be significant level of communities engagement. In terms of consistent language, I think one of the things we're going to have to work on is the phrase or the word tangata whenua and mana whenua. There is, as we know in Auckland, an issue with the number of tangata whenua who are not mana whenua and are effectively, in their eyes, excluded from representation. They're not picked up by the mainstream, and mana whenua effectively excludes them because they are not local. So there are some challenges going forward, but this is a really good start. It's not surprising, it's affirming. The environment is number one, and sustainability is I think, an overarching thing that we need to look at in terms of the Vision project. So I think I really want to pick that up. It's not just an environmental thing, but the sustainability thing is something that we need to flow through the associated projects. Yeah, I'm happy with where we are, but we have a long way to go.
Any other speakers? Councillor Arbery.
Yeah, I wasn't going to speak. On those prioritisations, I think that's just a bit of evidence that points towards the tyranny of the majority, and that most people aren't Māori, so they don't feel that sense of disconnect between the culture that you're brought up in and I suppose the city that you're living in. What I did find interesting that's relevant to this is that it aligns really closely with vital signs, which I think is a good thing that we should keep anchoring back to, because that was a really comprehensive consultation process that tried to target all aspects of the community, and any of these smaller surveys isn't as thorough in my view.
Any further speakers? Councillor Baldock, do you wish to exercise a right of reply? Okay, in that case, I'll put the resolutions. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Abstentions? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you. Let's move now to page 62. The Independent Sustainability Advice Next Steps, and the presenter is Jeremy Bowes, Manager of Strategic and Corporate Planning. Thank you. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you would all picked up on so far, this report kind of leads on from the previous conversation, an interesting one, particularly around how we prioritise in the future. You can see even from that discussion, sustainability, the various elements of it, the four well-beings, prioritisation, and it means different things to different people. And that'll be one of the challenges through this sustainability work. Effectively, this report operationalises your decision through the annual plan in July, and just puts a bit of a structure around where we go next. The aim is to bring it into the Project Advisory Board model, which you're very familiar with, which has been working quite well. A direct line of reporting to the Chief Executive, a dotted line effectively up through to Council as and when required. And then the next steps are around recruiting the right people, finding those people, creating the scope and the purpose that is consistent with that resolution back in May through into July, and then blending it in to the other processes underway. We've spoken about the City Vision process this morning. The City Vision will be a sustainability framework effectively itself. How this advisory board helps that process is something which I've tried to explore through the paper. I think with the short-term focus, as per the resolution in May and then through into July, short-term focus on the long-term plan, but the medium-term focus needs to be within that City Vision project. That will be a four well-beings vision. I can't say it will, because the intention is to co-design that with other willing partners, but the logical starting point is a four well-being sustainable development base. We referenced the Waikato Wellbeing Project, which is very similar in scope. It took a couple of years to go from eureka moment through to actually having a document with targets. And we're hoping that the City Vision project doesn't take that long, but that will be the life of the Project Advisory Board beyond the immediate aim of the LTP process, but then to embed that through the City Vision project and then embed it through Council's processes from there on. So operationalising a decision already made, giving us a bit of leeway to go off and make it happen, and we'll report back to you in due course.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any questions, colleagues? Councillor Robson, and then followed by Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, as the effectively the original author of the words Independent Sustainability Advisory Board, when the project was originally envisaged, and some discussions amongst a couple of councillors led to this, I'm concerned that the labelling's changed and it's now become a project board. If one looks at the Council 28 May 2020 draft annual plan motion, it's very clear in the wording of that in my view the board has and should operate independently at a strategic level. That's why it's called a board and not an advisory group. And in the parts of the motion C1 and C2, it's clear that it starts at strategy, program and project level. And for some reason, and I know there hasn't been a lot of discussion in the detail of this report certainly with myself, I haven't been party to a significant discussion around this. I think we're missing something here. and I'm concerned that this is being seen as a, we're missing the fact that sustainability and the purpose of...
Can I be so bold with the chair and just ask you to frame it as a question?
Yep.
There's certainly debate.
Thank you.
That will definitely
Sorry.
come. Yeah.
I apologise. This is a personal passion point, so I apologise for... How did we get to miss that strategic board governance level framing and wind up labelling this as project? How did the word project get in here? Because I don't remember any debate that put that at the centre of this.
The Project Advisory Board is the phrasing we use for these sort of boards. In looking at the scope and the purpose, I would suggest this is much more around programme in this instance and broader than a single programme of works. It's a way of thinking. So I think we can cover that in the scope and purpose, and the point is well made and well noted. The Project Advisory Board is simply the PAB as a shorthand that as an organisation we understand and are used to.
Councillor Hughes, you had a question.
Yeah, just so around, I think the big challenge we have is to how do we make people and our organisation feel like, how do they see themselves in this? So how do we make this real and not like an exercise in a report? And that I think the key to making it real for our community and for our organisation is in the way that we are able to engage it. So I'm wondering the stakeholder group underpinning this. How do you have we thought about how this group might look, or is that in the next process?
So just to clarify, the stakeholder group underpinning it, you started off talking about staff and how it would be...
Yeah, sorry, I'm not explaining myself very well. I guess it's the you've got on your document here, this is the community sustainability reference group is what I'm referring to. So how do you see them interacting with the project advisory board, or is that yet to be sort of decided?
Definitely yet to be decided, but I think the original resolution envisaged 2 levels of involvement, 2 levels of advice. There was the higher board, and then there was a reference group. We use reference groups on a number of processes, projects and stuff around this organisation. Generally they provide an on-the-ground, what's happening locally, what's local touch points. If the board is a sort of nationally recognised skills, relevant skills, experience, knowledge, they may not have that Tauranga-centric view of things. Using the community reference group as well as 760 staff and all the input that can be provided from yourselves as others, that will help that project advisory board or the program advisory board or the advisory board to have a Tauranga focus as well, a bit more input from them.
Councillor Hollis and then Cloud.
In paragraph 13 about frameworks, there is 2 frameworks mentioned. Will we choose one of those, and if so, will we be party to that decision?
At the moment, the intention would be that staff would prepare a paper for the incoming advisory board and say, here's a bunch of different, I've used a couple here. Donut economics has come up in conversations as well, and there are others. Essentially, they all come back to a very similar sort of thing, and they all come back reasonably quickly to the 4 well-beings and sustainable development as in the Act. So we're sort of circling back, using other models, circling back to the Act quite quickly. The intention would be to put that to the advisory board, ask their advice, because they are an advisory board, and then staff, probably the executive team, would make a call as to the model. We would then share that with you guys and say, this is where we're going.
Councillor Cloud.
Sorry, if you look at the
Yes.
diagram in paragraph 54, it effectively shows that. So the advisory board is effectively advised, direct reporting line to the chief executive as advice. And the organisation provides the recommendations and reports to council, but there's also a dotted line which recognises that on occasions, as have other advisory boards, so Harrington for example, the members of that advisory board may speak directly to council on matters as well.
Through the chair, I would expect council ultimately to make that final decision in respect of the model that we choose.
Councillor Clout, followed by Hughes.
Thank you. Two questions. First one to you, Jeremy. What's our level of staffing already within the sustainability space in council? Because I'm understanding that we already have a sustainability carbon reduction type resource.
Someone over to Nick, where this stuff sits.
Yeah, so current staffing is something that well, we're looking at what that would look like for the future and how to deal with this. So I would say currently we're not set up to deal with this. So what we're looking at are a few options of whether we get staff of our own to do this work early on, or if it's something that we would outsource. So we're actually scanning the market at the moment to see if, with the staff that we've got and between the sustainability and waste team and the strategy team, can put some higher level management into to lead an external consultant, for instance, to do the strategy work, because the resource draw on this will be quite heavy in terms of community, stakeholder engagement, that sort of thing, and with yourselves. So we see it as quite a resource demanding piece of work. So we're just trying to get the best bang for buck, I guess, with the money that we put into this annual plan.
Thank you. And my second question through the chair is to councillors Hughes and Robson. When you first sort of looked at setting this framework up, were you expecting council to be employing equivalent of 2 full-time extra staff members, or were you looking more at external stakeholders and being involved in this board? So that's a question through the chair.
Councillor Hughes and Robson, do you wish to respond to that? You don't have to, but if you wish
Sure,
to.
I'm happy to respond. I guess it's we at that point we hadn't had any specific. There were 2 staff that were moving out of council, and so at that point it was like, well, what does that look like if 2 staff don't move out of that council? But from where I sit, I'm happy to work with the recommendations that come out of this and for the best outcomes, really. What's the best framing for this, and to get a report based on that will be helpful.
Councillor Robson, do you also wish to respond?
Yeah, I think I do. This, I think I can say this, and if I step on any sort of line about disclosure, I'm sure the Chief Executive will put me straight. There was a discussion in terms of putting together the draft annual plan. And in the draft annual plan, Councillor Hughes identified very quickly that some resource in this space was, you know, part of the discussion, and observed that that seemed to be a bad message. And I, recognising the wisdom in that, saw an opportunity to perhaps send and reverse the message, and then there was various conversations and we wound up where we wound up. So that's all good. In the original proposal for funding, I think if Councillor Clout remembers, there was a suggestion that it was a small percentage of the annual plan, which I think gave some indication of the type of resource I think is appropriate for this type of, not project, this type of reorienting a city and its governance into the space of sustainability, right? This is a big fundamental shift, certainly that I'm looking for and hoping to see in this city, that everything we do sits under a sustainable framework, because if we were not sustainable, the city ceases to exist. So in terms of resourcing, my ideal envisaged was significantly more, and certainly a significant amount coming in at the governance level to inform a group that really, I don't think yet gets it. And thanks for the opportunity.
Any further questions? Councillor Arbery.
What do you envisage this board, or how will they work with the LTP process, or are you thinking it'll just be at that vision stage and then they won't get too involved with the LTP itself. What was your thinking?
The aim in the short term is to be involved in the LTP process. Time is tight. We are inputting projects into LTPs now. The key part of the LTP process will be that overall view, which an external bunch of people may be able to provide some advice on across the 4 wellbeings or the emerging model that they've got. Prioritisation, you talked about it in the last paper with Fiona, how we prioritise both OPEX and CAPEX, a lot more focus probably on the CAPEX eventually, will be very important through this LTP because it's no secret that there's more stuff to go in than there is space for stuff. I imagine that the Project Advisory Board will have a view as to how we help embed some of these principles into that prioritisation process. We're talking about the outcomes, we're already gathering information on outcomes across those 5 outcomes for each of the projects, also against the wellbeings, and then the Project Advisory Board may be able to provide an extra layer of information across those capital bids. That's probably the main area.
Yeah, through the chair, look, I'm also conscious that other models of creating these types of frameworks aren't done by organisations in isolation to themselves. And in the Waikato, for example, it's across the Waikato. In the Eastern Bay of Plenty, it's across the Eastern Bay of Plenty. And interestingly, in the Waikato, it's actually not a process that actually is being led by any of the particular councils. It's led by, I think,
Energy Trust.
The Energy Trust. So also, I think this process or journey or program that we are embarking on, in my view, does need to involve other key organisations and agencies. And I do also think that it fits nicely into a conversation that we will be soon having with central government around caring for communities. And so I think the 400 that we have in the kitty at the moment may well be just the starting point, and particularly if our discussions with central government are successful, that number could well increase significantly.
Councillor Hughes, followed by final question, Councillor Robson.
It's just a question around the visioning work and the sustainability framework, because and I can see how do we intend to make sure that they don't become too duplicated pieces of work that is in the short term and the medium term, to ensure that we sort of really are working together along that journey.
Yes, it's tricky. Creating that pathway, if I was to try and write it all down with nice boxes and lines, it's very tricky, but keeping conscious of it through this whole process is relevant. What Marty just said about other agencies, I've mentioned that the visioning needs to be a co-design with other agencies. At the moment, the Project Advisory Board, the Sustainability Framework, is a TCC-centric model. My personal aim would be that we have a city vision which has a city-centric model for sustainability, but that's the next step, and that needs to be worked with partners, and I can't speak for that process yet because we're right at the beginning of it. So being very aware throughout is key to it.
Councillor Robson.
Yeah, happy to move, Chair.
Okay.
Happy to second.
Councillor Hughes has seconded that. Do you wish to speak to it, Mover?
Yeah, look, I think this is a positive. The very fact that we made this commitment in the annual plan is a positive. And what I see in this report is an acknowledgement in different ways of the importance of that decision in the annual plan and the importance of actually executing the spirit of that decision as we work through. What I also see in this report is evidence that we've got work to do. That's not a criticism of anyone, because I think what I see is people embracing this with positive intent. But it does, given the size of it and its importance, it does challenge us to think in new ways, to use words in perhaps differently to the way we've used them before, not try and fit this into the old council project paradigm. And I appreciate Jeremy Bose's words that this has to be a city thing. I'd like to think that at central government, they're thinking about sustainability as an Aotearoa New Zealand thing, right? Because it's about, genuinely about a future. It's about having a future. It's about bequeathing to future generations the ability to live well and provide a future further. So this is a big, big topic, and it's a big topic for an organisation that, you know, is got a certain kaupapa and got a certain way of working. It's a big, so I see positivity in this. What I like about the recommendation and why I'm happy to move it is it talks about authorising the chief executive to abstain. We can argue about the wording, but consistent with council's decision. And I think that gives some scope for flexibility in how we go forward, and some engagement between the chief executive and the management side and the governance side and other stakeholders to sort of move this thing carefully to make sure we take the people with us and achieve the outcomes we're looking for. Yeah, we're heading in the right direction here. I don't want to be seen to be holding it back. I just want to make sure we don't squeeze it into the old box and fall into the hole that so many have fallen into before and actually not deliver the outcomes our community wants. And going back to the preceding motion, the previous motion, it's not a green thing, right? This is not a green thing. Sustainability is cultural sustainability, social sustainability, economic sustainability, Kelvin, just to let you know we're not forgetting, and environmental sustainability, right? Sustainability runs all those. It's not one of them. It's not beneath. It drives all of them. So, yeah, we're heading in the right direction, slowly, bit by bit. Good.
Thank you. Seconder, you wish to speak now?
I'll reserve.
Any other speakers to the motion? Councillor Aubrey.
Yeah, the main thing I'm wanting to see is a tangible difference in how we're approaching things. So I wouldn't want this to be an exercise in creating nice paperwork and nice strategies that sit over there. I'd be quite keen for them to be involved in those LTP processes, as you've mentioned, so that there are some tangible changes based on this expertise that this board is bringing. And just want to support the knowledge and skills and experience that you're looking for, and I think that will be an excellent start.
Councillor Clout, then Mayor Powell.
Thank you very much. I certainly support the concept of setting this board up. I guess my concern is that it looks like it's becoming a very council-centric board rather than a community-centric one, and I would definitely like to see other stakeholder groups having buy-in to this process and even helping to fund some of it as it expands. So I think that's really important. The second thing is in paragraph 60, just to sort of highlight this, the potential disadvantage of this approach is that the focus on council and council's activities may be diluted in favour of a whole of city approach. And also the fact that we're doing this and potentially muddying the waters with our city vision. So I'm not sure how the sustainability space is going to meld with our city vision work. So that's just a little question mark I've got. But I think it's a step in the right direction with some of those caveats.
Mayor Powell.
Chair, great endeavours, achievements and accomplishments come from big visions, or a big vision. And while some sitting around this table will argue that big visions have led us into disarray, I would argue exactly the opposite. I think piecemeal tactical thinking has led us into a position where we find ourselves with a Tauranga city, New Zealand's 5th largest, arguably fastest growing, that is lacked vision of any sort. We have an opportunity with this process, colleagues, to change that, really, and to enable a discussion with the community around a big vision for the future of this city, and to take it forward as a modern and progressive metropolis. And, you know, we discussed earlier on Just for example, because we discussed it today, the issue of the greater allocation of green space, something very important to my heart as a city grows, that people have the ability to, to have these amenities, which I believe we currently lack, and lack badly here in Tauranga City. So I do encourage that there is an ability for a big and bold vision, as opposed to a tactical vision, and most particularly a tactical vision that has disconnected, siloed thinking, which I think will not serve the communities of the future. Thank you, Chair.
Any further speakers, or I'll ask Councillor Hughes if she wishes to speak. Sure, Councillor Bullock.
Yep. Yeah, I support this option, and I note that there were 3 options in the report, so there were 3 directions we could have gone, and I'm actually pleased that we have moved the recommended option of 2, which enables the board to merge into the City Vision project, including the development of Council's strategic framework that will sit beneath it to help to element the City Vision, and I support the words of the Mayor in terms of the city needing a vision. Sustainability, as the mover said, is not just a green thing, it is everything in our city that needs to be sustainable. I recognise the real role that Councillor Hughes has had in getting this to the agenda in the AP and bringing it to the table here today. I'm looking forward to what she has to say about the motion, because certainly the environment is a very, very important part of that sustainability. But I remember for all the years I've sat here at annual plans and LTPs and so on, there used to be one councillor who was councillor for about 18 years, as I recall. Every time we passed a rate rise of 3%, 3.5%, 4%, his opening words were, "It's not sustainable." And not sustainable can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I take the view that our rundown community halls in the city are not sustainable. Some of our amenities for a growing city, in part, like what the Mayor has just said, are not sustainable for us. We are the 5th largest city, and being sustainable involves all those things, and I take heart in the skill sets that are looked at there in paragraph 48A to F. There will be some high quality people with experience that can help with this process, as well as that community-led, what do we call the group again? Sorry, I can't see it there, but we won't lose the local input into it all. But we definitely need to be building, especially as we go into this LTP, we need to be building a sustainable long-term plan in all the areas of our society so that our city can prosper. Thank you.
Speaking to it myself, sorry I jumped the gun, apologies Councillor Kitty, I called myself. I do support the blend between the ISAB and the City Vision process, which is option 2. And one of the reasons for that is the weight that our community placed on sustainability and the environment through the Vital Signs survey, and also just our small snapshot where we got the 500 or so odd responses to the community outcomes, the weighting that our community placed on that as well. So I think that's an appropriate thing to do. Councillor Kitty.
Thank you. Just endorse what you said. I was going to bring up the vital signs as well, so thank you for jumping the gun on me with that, Councillor Morris. Also am hoping that we can take a look around New Zealand. I know of one particular area that has done a sustainability framework that's been outstanding, so am really hoping that we look around our different regions in New Zealand, specifically the South Island, see what they've done, what they've achieved in a very small period of time, because I think we could potentially emulate that here if we get all our community groups working together. Thank you.
Councillor Hughes.
I think the sustainability framework's intention was to challenge the way that our city functions within the boundaries of our ecosystem while ensuring people in our community can thrive. So there's that tension between making sure that we are able to have a future for our grandchildren, but we're also able to support all of the communities within the way that we operate. And I think that I really liked what Dawn said about how can we get our communities involved in this, because really we can do all the high level talk about sustainability, but what does it mean to people? What does it mean to each individual and to our businesses, to the way that we function, to how our council functions and how our teams operate? And I think that's where, if we can blend these two to where we're looking in the short term at how our organisation operates and what we need to think about now, and in terms of what our city vision is, then that's the best way to blend them together, because our city vision, as Jeremy pointed out, is really a sustainability framework. That is what the overarching opportunity is here. So I really appreciate the fact that it's been resourced. Having a high-level team to work with our organisation and with the community will be incredibly helpful. There's subject matter experts in each of these fields are really important, and I like the list that has been put together here. So I'm really very excited about the future of this, and I can see that the organisation and the work that Jeremy's done has shown that we're also ready for this journey. So I commend it.
Councillor Robson, do you wish to exercise the right to reply?
Yeah, it's the comments made, I think, reveal the positive energy that this idea is gathering, and the recognition also that we don't want this to be another draft environmental policy which is currently sitting somewhere on a metaphorical shelf, because in the digital age, of course, we don't stick it on shelves anymore. And there is a risk of that, and we need to be aware of that. And I think Councillor Kitty's observation that we need to look at where models are actually working and delivering outcomes as opposed to just outputs is actually sound advice. I mean, I look at it, for instance, paragraph 48, and I look at 48F, the environment, particularly air and water quality, and I think of the phrase tangata whenua, and I think of whenua, and I think of land, and I'm thinking, really? Air and water quality? This sounds like, oh, regional council will need to input somewhere. The land, where is the land in 48F? For God's sake, tangata whenua, mana whenua, land. Where's the land in 48F? We have a way to go, yeah? And we've got to be careful that we go through this slowly and use the wisdom of the subject matter experts, some of whom actually reside in our city. We've got to make sure, in my view, that the board doesn't become too insular. My biggest concern, I suppose, at the moment would be the board. We appoint some people to the board and they own it, like there's only one view on this. The appointments to this board are absolutely critical, and above all, I think those people must be open-minded and still evolving. I don't want subject matter experts on this board who have already made their decision, decided where their sustainability turanga waiwai is, started building the Pa Palisades and intend to defend it against all comers. That's not what we need here. There's an openness, a willingness to engage at every level that will make this succeed. Look, this is going to go through. I'm pleased the Chief Executive is picking up one hell of a baton when he accepts the passing of this motion. Yeah, good luck, sir.
I'll now put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Abstentions? I declare that abstention from Councillor Hollis. I declare that carried. Thank you, colleagues. Let's move on now to the final agenda item, page 74, the long-term plan, timeline, work streams and strategic approach and level of service reviews. Speaking to this paper is Josh Logan, Team Leader of Corporate Planning.
So, continuation of the theme, we've had visions and outcomes and the operational side of LTPs. This is part of our ongoing commitment to keep you up to date with the journey of the LTP. You will get very, very fed up with us eventually by the end of the year, I imagine, because as you can see from this, there's a lot of work coming through. Most of what you've got in front of you is an explanation of those that process. That's the expected timeline, the timeframes. It builds on the report to Council on the 11th of August, where we set out the hexagon diagram with all the bits and pieces. This just gives a bit more flesh to some of those projects. Topic 3 within there is talking about that LTP strategic approach, and the last conversation just used the phrase sustainable LTP. That will be a key focus and a key challenge over the next few months. As we've spoken to you before, the intention is to create 2 models for the LTP at the starting point. A first one we described as core, committed and prioritised. It's basically, it's not a bare bones, but it's a bare bones plus. It takes some of the revenue which we know we've been offered from other sources, particularly the government through the TPAPA process and others. But it's pretty much a minimalist is probably the wrong phrase as well, but it's what we can afford within current constraints. The second model then is the bigger model, which is the one which is called connected and growing communities, and that's what the city needs, what we believe the city will need. There will be a gap between the two which will be significant, and one of your biggest challenges through the LTP process will be to navigate that gap. We're not going to navigate that gap today, but we start tomorrow with a workshop on the financials and the financial strategy, and that will be part of that process, and that conversation will carry on through the next 6 months and then into 2021. The fourth part of this process is just to reiterate around level of service reviews. That was one of the hexagon items on the 11th of August. You have been through quite a significant review of levels of service through the annual plan. Given that process, given the depth and the breadth of that process and the outcomes of it, at the staff level we don't expect to go back into that unless you tell us that's what you want to do. There's a lot of work involved, and as we saw through the annual plan, the outcomes are quite tricky, quite difficult to make any meaningful change. So we're suggesting at this stage we're not going to go through a comprehensive level of service review. We'll just take the levels of service pretty much as they are now. As you get individual activity plans and their key performance indicators, their targets for the years, you may have some conversations around those and dial up or dial down. That's fine. That's still on the table, very much so. But running a comprehensive review of all our levels of service, a bit like what we did in the second annual plan, but for a 10-year process and for wider, bigger aims, that's not something we see as necessary at the moment. Happy to take questions, Mr. Chair.
First question, Councillor Clout.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I really like the 2-scenario approach. I think that's really important that we have those 2 scenarios. I guess my question is, and based on experience where every time we do an annual plan or an LTP, we end up compromising, we land somewhere in the middle. It just seems to be the way it always is. If in that case, would we be taking the most basic scenario and then adding on to it, or would we be taking the more complex scenario and then taking away from it? What would be the way that you could see it going?
Given the size of the gap, probably the former. But it's very much, we used the phrase iterative process earlier on, and very much that is the process. Christine is aching to tell me something different.
So, I mean, I see it as being the base and add, because the scenario 2, which is the connected and growing communities, we actually think we should actually talk to the community about the size and scale of that and say, actually, this is what we need for our city to, 1, deliver on the NPS, to make a resilient and sustainable city, and here's the size of our challenge as a city, and it will also enable you to engage with central government about the size and the scale of gap, because if we keep on prioritising but never actually saying this is actually what the city needs to deliver on the needs of the city, we're actually not having the right conversation. So you need to come up with a base, a committed and prioritised envelope, and that's what you seek to fund through the LTP. And then you also need to say, but actually this is what the city needs, and it's not a gold-plated need. This is actually what we think we need to keep a housing supply, to have connected communities, for community to have access to reasonable and appropriate community amenity and community infrastructure. This is what this looks like. we can't afford it, and here's the size of the gap, and here's what our community is missing out on, and the consequences are that they don't actually get to do what they need to do in their own communities and neighbourhoods. House prices are increasing, our businesses don't have land to go and build our economy on, and we need to tell that story, we think, through this LTP.
Thank you. Any other questions, colleagues? Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, just following on from that question from Councillor Clout and your comments, Jeremy, about not going back to that level of service review during the annual plan. Does it really have any, what we passed today doesn't really have any binding effect though, because what I'm always nervous about in LTPs is that when we get down the track and then we suddenly do go back. That level of service, can I just clarify, was about reducing levels of service in order to meet the COVID impacts financially and so on. But you are clear about if we wanted to increase levels of service, or perhaps on one or two things we might reduce going forward, that's still a possibility.
It's always a possibility. The intent of bringing this to you now is to say, if you've got things in your mind that we need to spend 3 months working on, can we hear about it now rather than February? So the intention at the moment, we've got a clean slate. There's 2 or 3 items I think I mentioned somewhere in the report. There's obviously the road reseal work, which has already been previously commissioned. That's on the list. So excluding those ones, there was a list somewhere, paragraph 26, excluding the things in 26, we're not expecting to go anywhere deeply into levels of service. But if there's something which is sitting in your mind saying we really need to nail that upwards or downwards through the LTP, can we hear about it now rather than wait further down the process and then do it as a rush job?
Thank you, Jeremy. I watch America's Got Talent and Britain's Got Talent, and I see these people that can read people's minds. I think you might have a spot there, because it was that resealing issue that I was going to bring up. I think that's something we do have to investigate with our community.
Any further questions, colleagues, or is somebody prepared to move the recommendations or something different? Councillor Robson's indicated, and is there a seconder, Mayor Powell? Councillor Robson, are you prepared to move the recommendations on page 74?
Yes.
And seconded by Mayor Powell. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Robson?
Yeah, again, and Jeremy's right, we've talked outcomes, we've talked that framework, that overarching kaupapa, if you like, that needs to be driven through this, I think, which is sustainability. And now we're talking about how we start to make this thing real and how we create the decisions, the good decisions that actually make where we're trying to get to a reality. I'm comfortable at the scope of work. There's a lot here. I just want to make one observation in relation to some of the issues that have been raised about the gap. I don't think the gap has been a product of simply siloed thinking. I don't think the gap between where we are, if you like, with that core, that affordable thing, and where we want to be has been a product of a lack of vision or a lack of intent or a lack of willingness. I actually think there has been a unifying kaupapa, if you like, that's driven the creation of the tauranga of today. Personally, I want to see us get rid of it. That kaupapa, unspoken, was a market-led, developer-driven growth, and trust us, you'll get trickle down. And where we are today is a result of actually following that, not overtly, not explicitly, but that's the path we followed. That gave us our city plan. That gave us a situation where we decided not to do what other cities do and put a differential on commercial ratepayers, which today effectively gives us a $50 million shortfall in revenue. The decisions made under that kaupapa have created effectively a $1 billion shortfall in the resourcing available to the city. That $1 billion explains the lack of amenity that so many people rightly decry. And when we start thinking about this and start moving forward, we really need to bear the lessons of history in mind. Don't, as so many do, go to history to anchor their prejudices, to defend their errors, but acknowledge why we are where we are, change, and deliver what this community needs. This is a good step along that path, but denying our history will not help us create the future we want.
Thank you. Seconder, do you wish to speak now?
Chair, I'm pleased Councillor Robson talked about the history, because I'm not sure what I heard, but other than we don't have siloed thinking, I would argue that we have very much got disconnected silo thinking, a lot of thinking that happens in silos that are completely unconnected from each other. And I'll just use, because it's very topical, the buses. We have one council running buses, big yellow things that are, I think, Heidi, correct me if I'm wrong, but the average usage is 7.8%, or 7.8 people per very large 44-seater bus, and another council running the infrastructure, or not, as we're being accused of. So I think that is siloed thinking that has proved an abject failure, and there are pockets of that all through the city. Councillor Robson's right about the differential on commercial ratepayers, but it does seem historically that Tauranga has done things differently to most other cities, and as a consequence we are in that billion-dollar hole, and as a consequence we have all the problems that we're now trying to address, as well as coping with continued growth. If somebody can tell me how you stop growth, I will listen to the argument. People say they want growth to stop, and they can't give me an argument as to how it could happen ever so far. Very open to it. If it's building a wall on the Kaimais and along the seafront and anywhere else, then okay, that I won't really listen to because it's impractical. People want to live here. They want to come here. They want to be a part of this extraordinary environment. The first item, or the second item that we dealt with, exemplified why we want to live here. We have got to manage growth better, not try and stop it, because it's going to happen. So the siloed thinking that I think has been hugely problematic for Tauranga in the past does need to stop. So I agree with Councillor Robson wholeheartedly that we do need to recognise and address the history, and the only way to change things is to do things differently going forward. And I come back to having a big, bold vision for the future, but making sure that it does address the growth forecasted, which is considerable, and that we do, end up in a different position to that which has happened in the past for future generations. Thank you.
Any other speakers to the resolution? Councillor Arbery.
Yeah, one that may come up in February, or maybe one that could be added to that paragraph 26, is the review of our external funding that we give to other entities. I think that's something that comes up every once in a while. So, okay, ignore me.
Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, I think the opportunity here is, and using that example of buses, and I know buses aren't on our radar, but it's a reflection of when the decision comes forward to give free buses for school children. Then, and if you're working in a silo, you may look at that in terms of congestion, but when you're looking at it in terms of the well-beings, you may look at it in terms of, well, what are the social outcomes of, and what is the benefit of having a kid being able to make it to school when they otherwise wouldn't be able to make it to school. So if we are able to look at that across all of our projects and all of the way that we think about things and the way that we procure and the way that we operate, then incrementally we're able to, across our silos, solve some of the issues that we have as a city, which we are unable to do if we're just asking communities to solve the issues of our vulnerable people. They're unable to do that. If we're asking the transport team to solve the issues of congestion, they're unable to do that unless we're really prepared to look at what the benefits are and what the outcomes are, not across silos, but the outcomes across our cities, and really understand that genuinely from each of our staff members and each of our community members, so that we can meet some of the aspirations that we have in the future.
I do actually have a point of order.
Okay,
So,
please, yes, let's hear it.
it's not currently in paragraph 26. So what I was referring to was the bulk funding. Oh, sorry, the annual or the repeated funding that we give to the likes of Tourism Bay of Plenty and the Art Gallery and Priority One. Our CCOs and other entities, which keeps being brought up. So I suspect it will keep being brought up in the future. We might as well add it to the work list.
Thank you. I'll accept that point of order as personal explanation. Any further speakers? I've got Councillor Salisbury.
Yeah, I think this report really highlights the huge workload that we have before us and the staff, and I think the strategic approaches are very wise. The timelines are very tight. But I think we do have an opportunity to bring an LTP that is both aspirational and sustainable in all its forms. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity of really working with our community and bringing everyone along with us to create an LTP. As we've said before, we had an annual plan that we were all proud of, and I think this is a great opportunity to have a long-term plan that we can all be proud of. So I'm looking forward to the process, even though the workload is going to be huge.
Councillor Clout.
Thank you. This will be my third LTP that I'll be having the pleasure of working on. And I have to say, first glance, this looks like it's going to be the most comprehensive and I think well organised process. So thank you very much to management and staff for your involvement in putting this framework together. It's fantastic. I note that quite a few of the committees are going to be delegated some of the sort of activity or area by area aspects to be considering, and that's fantastic, so well done. I don't see much coming to PSOC, so as chair of PSOC, feel free, please, to put some more my way. Thank you.
As Roger Moore once said, speak now, if ever hold your peace. Any further speakers? Yes, Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, I too thank the staff for putting together not just this report, but the way they start working on the LTP straight after an AP, in fact even before. And I hope this is going to be, as Councillor Clout said, a great process, but more than a process, the outcome that we finally get to will deliver, that we won't pull back at the brink. I note that we just before this passed the setting up of the Project Advisory Board of Sustainability, and we noted at the time that that included things like people with experience in business and economy, including tourism and Maori economy. So I will, at risk of being thrashed by a right of reply, again push back on the oft-repeated comments of my colleague Councillor Robson, who suggests that we could somehow slice the pie differently in rates and take 50 million from the business community without it being raising questions of sustainability, or to suggest that somehow over the last, I don't know how many years, because actually we used to have one of the higher business differentials, and then it was cancelled when I wasn't on council, but it was done for good reasons to give our business community a chance to do well and compete, and they have. But to suggest that we could have taken $1 billion in rates out of that sector of our society without some effects on their sustainability, to me just always beggars belief, and I wonder why we keep hearing that speech, but I'm sure I'll get a reply on it. This morning, though, has been a very good exercise. Sometimes when you listen to the media, you wonder if you were in the same room as what you read in the paper or heard on the radio, and this morning there was a radio interview about our council's operations, and I wonder if we are in the same place. This has been an amazing committee meeting where we've gone through a number of items in a rapid speed. We haven't even hit our two-hour limit yet. We'll be adjourning for a cup of coffee soon, having done good work for the city. And I think that is what we need to begin to promote to our city, that we are functioning, we are doing what we need to be doing, and working around this table the way we ought to be for the interests of the city. Thank you.
Councillor Robson, do you wish to exercise the right of reply?
I believe I was invited to do so, Chair.
Yeah, look, I'm not in the habit of thrashing people. I've never been an advocate of thrashing. I don't think thrashing is the way one deals with difference or challenge. I would suggest that a cup of coffee, councillor, is a far more appropriate, civilised and 2020 type way of addressing these things. I'd just like to literally respond to some of the comments made. I appreciate the support of my seconder, but I didn't say there were no silos. I said the issue is not just silos. So I acknowledge there were silos. I didn't say I want to stop growth. As a matter of fact, in 2015, I believe I can claim some degree of authorship over the kaupapa of that long-term plan when I said our objective here is to successfully manage a growing city.
Point of order, Mayor Powell.
Say that. I said that some do, a number do, and I was just responding to the comments made by members of the community.
I'll accept that as a personal explanation. And Councillor Robson, continue.
And the issue with regard to a growing city, of course, is that growth is not a function of the decisions made by council alone or even council significantly. It's actually a function of the settings of central government. And when central government set those settings, it would be very nice if the rules they put in place meant that we were able to effectively tax the exacerbators and or the beneficiaries of that growth, instead of being left with a blunt tool of a property tax. While I'm on the topic of central government setting up unhelpful structures, the observations by Councillor Heidi Hughes are extraordinarily apposite. The idea that you create two different organisations with the responsibility of running your public transport system is just bloody nuts. However, until central government changes that, we're going to have to find a way of working with our colleagues at Regional Council. And in that regard, I welcome their offer of supporting and perhaps contributing to bus stops. I just want them to give us a bus system that the bus stops will complement, that actually works for our city. With regard to the observations of Councillor Salisbury with regarding the annual plan and her pride in it, I too take pride in it. At a public meeting of the Papamoa Residents and Ratepayers Association, I commended the annual plan, particularly the shift in burden from our residential ratepayers to the commercial ratepayers, and the shift in burden from the lower value properties to the higher value properties. It's a kaupapa I believe that some of my more socially progressive colleagues would support in spades. Look, it's a big, complex topic. We're not captains of our ship or masters of everything here. We're doing our best with an enormous set of constraints. But we're heading in the right direction, and we're closing the $1 billion gap. In theory, if all goes well, it'll be closed by 2035. Thank you.
Thank you. The right of reply being exercised, I'll put those 4 resolutions to the committee. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Abstentions? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, colleagues, for the day. Been interesting listening to the debate, and there are no further items, so I declare the meeting closed. Councillor